Hello, and welcome back to Downtime Activities, and welcome back to our bonus action podcast video series. Today we're going to be going over Pre-built. Let's just do a whole new one.
You just want to do a whole new one?
Let's just do a whole new one. The whole thing felt clunky and awkward from the beginning. One more time! Alright. Hello and welcome back to Downtime Activities, and welcome back to the Bonus Action Podcast. Today we're going to be going over Homebrew versus pre-built world stories, campaigns, adventures in RPGs. Kind of going into some details on both our preferences and how to do both well. I think will be a good kind of overall what the conversation is about today. To start, do you mind kind of just... Everyone probably knows this that's listening to this, but kind of break down what the difference between a pre-built and a homebrew is.
I mean, Dungeons & Dragons in particular, but also systems like Star Wars Tabletop RPG and Savage Worlds, as well as, I guess, Pathfinder's probably the other really big one alongside D&D, constantly release pre-built adventures, campaigns, settings, which are... kind of exactly what they sound like. They're built by the people who created the system or a team associated with them. It's usually its own setting with its own lores. It's dungeons already mapped out. It's puzzles with the solutions laid out for the game master. Enemies statted out. And they usually have recommended levels. You know, it's meant to run levels 1 through 5 or 1 through 17 or something like that. Sometimes they're designed to kind of stitch together. In the case of... the 5th edition Dungeon of the Mad Mage is supposed to follow Dragon Heist. They're kind of... You can run either one independently, but they're kind of built to operate that way. And they tend to just be these like big, kind of grandiose set-piece adventures or stories. A lot of them will introduce new mechanics, new magic items, or new weapons or equipment, and sometimes even player classes and stuff like that, and it's just like it's all built around the same kind of grand theme, and they're pre-built stories. It's this is recommended for levels 1 through 5, a party of 4. So I'll get my 4 friends together, we'll stat up first level characters, and I'll just run literally page by page through this book, through the campaign. And then Homebrew is building all of that yourself. Whether it's kind of starting in an existent world or just creating one completely from scratch like we tend to do. You name every country, you decide what stat blocks you're using, what enemies the players are fighting, how long the campaign's going to go, the main villain and the overarching story, as well as kind of level requirements, stuff like that. Drawing your own maps, creating your own dungeons and everything else.
Yeah. I think that the typical perspective of most people is homebrew is better than pre-built, but pre-built is easier. So if you don't have time, do pre-built.
It is also just it's a contentious issue. Some people only play in pre-built worlds. Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, Dragonlance, even Spelljammer's coming back around. And some people sort of, refuse by the gods to ever set foot in a pre-built. Most people are kind of more somewhere in the middle, but it is like, amongst kind of diehard RPG fans, especially D&D players or Pathfinder players who have been in the systems for a long time, it can be kind of a bloodletting conversation as to
opinions
as to which one
strong opinions
people prefer.
Us as a group, we tend to prefer homebrew. We've run quite a few, however, pre-built stories. Some to fruition, some to a certain level of completion, some started and kind of petered off, but we've used different ones to differing levels and had different kind of levels of success and enjoyment, I would say, of those pre-builts. I think to start, before we, like I said, we tend to prefer homebrew, but we've run both and enjoyed both. To start with, I'd kind of like to just kind of go over pre-builts that we've run. We don't have to go into detail, but just kind of talking about what makes pre-builts good, what we like about pre-builts, the convenience and stuff like that. So to begin with, I think in our group, I'm the person who's run the most pre-built
without
games. And I'd say that, and this isn't, I kind of said, let's talk about the good, but I'm going to kind of quickly start by saying something that's more neutral to negative. And that is, I think it's a misconception that pre-builts are way easier for a new DM or a DM with less time on their hands than making a homebrew world. And I think that running both requires a decent bit of time and preparation. And I think there's a misconception that like, oh, well, I work a full-time job, I'm maybe going to school, I got this and that and the other thing, these other hobbies that I do. I don't have time to invent my own world. It'd be much easier if I just pick up the book and I can just show up on game day and run it from the book. And if you're running a pre-built well, you've probably pretty close to like read the book cover to cover before session 1. And that's a little like maybe at least the beginning sections of the book. Mm-hmm. You can definitely kind of read it as you go along, but if you're wanting to run it well, you kind of need to have an idea of where the story is going and how things are going to be flowing and who characters really are by the end of this story if you're going to be running it well from the beginning. So I'd start by saying if you feel like you need to do pre-built adventures because it's going to be easier and it'll be less time consuming, that time commitment's a lot closer than I think people believe,
if not more, from like what I've seen, and that really depends on the game master. Some game masters, like you in particular, are just really good at like, well, I hadn't planned for this, or I didn't really have anything planned here, but like, so we're just flying by the seat of our pants and making it up as we go. You're just very good at doing that. So having to spend so much time reading, sometimes chapters of a book just to prepare for the single session, and knowing where everything is within that book in order to get to the stat blocks you need, or get back to the information, it just seems to require a lot more work than you just like glancing back through your own notes for a world that you've built. But I'm sure there are plenty of DMs out there who don't necessarily have that same like ease of just
going with the flow.
Exactly, or are able to just like get through those books a lot quicker. We've done not necessarily a little bit of everything. We've done some older 5th edition stuff. We've done some stuff converted from older editions, as well as for a while we were kind of keeping up on pre-builts, at least sort of testing them out as each new one came up. We've been through Curse of Strahd, we've been through Dragon Heist, Tomb of Annihilation.
We got partway into Descent into Avernus.
Twice.
And both times those games kind of petered off.
We've been through some older 3.5 or even earlier stuff.
An older adventure, Witch Queen's Beloved, I believe is what it was originally called, is one that I took and converted into 5th edition to run almost entirely off of the fact. Brief aside here, starting into D&D, specifically into 5th edition when I transitioned from 3.5 to 5th edition, a big thing that kind of got me into D&D was when they were doing D&D Next kind of like game, or like Wizards was doing like testing stuff, and they were releasing videos playing it. And one of the first things I ever saw was a conversion of Witch Queen's Beloved into D&D Next at that time, what became 5th edition. And I fell in love with that adventure, which is why I went back and then converted it myself and then ran it myself eventually later.
Turns out ours ended almost exactly the same
identical.
way.
Turns out, if you're in a floating castle a floating fortress castle thing in the sky in space, and somebody casts Earthquake on that, it's going to end poorly. It doesn't matter who does it or where it's done. That being said,
I think we've dipped into some other pre-built stuff a little bit in kind of other systems. Obviously, Dread is a lot of pre-builts. Fiasco, which we are going to do gameplay of and a review of
at some point,
because it's an old favorite of ours as far as tabletop RPGs are concerned. Most of that is pre-built. Both of those are quite easy to build your own, but like those kind of those are a little different, but they kind of, I think, count as pre-built to some degrees. I believe Grey Squadron was a pre-built.
The adventure you guys went on, it was a Star Wars RPG pre-built story that I took to kind of run. The Grey Squadron aspect of it was my own thing that I applied to this story, and it was just a kind of a meant to be like a Age of Rebellion starting adventure, pretty much. All this to be said, in terms of pre-builts, what have been the ones that you think have gone the most successfully for us as a group?
We definitely played. We actually completed Curse of Strahd and Dragon Heist. Dragon Heist we completed more or less like sort of by its rules.
Yeah.
Curse of Strahd we found an early ending by kicking Strahd's ass when he showed up to invite us to dinner, and just like sort of ending the campaign way early.
Yeah.
We played in Tomb of Annihilation the longest, I think,
and we technically came to an ending in it in a way I'm guessing a lot of groups did, which is a near or total TPK inside the tomb itself, and we had all but I think 2 people made it out of a situation. It was like a 5-person party, and 2 of the people in it survived. Like that, yeah. One of which was like fully missing an arm or something like that from an Annihilation.
And that was after a lot of character turnover. And that's like Curse of to me, Curse of Tomb of Annihilation was what began to sort of precipitate our feelings towards pre-built in general, and I think that's probably true with Tomb of Annihilation and the older, like, was it just Tomb of Horrors? It was like so. Kind of the original like version of it. I think both of those had the same effect on a lot of play groups of starting to turn people a little bit against pre-built in general. But it wasn't necessarily the meat grinder element of Tomb of Annihilation that like really kind of did that to us. Meat grinder isn't really our play style anyway. But we've been through kind of a whole variety, and have started a whole variety more of pre-builts.
Really quickly, meat grinder for people. Most people probably know this, but a meat grinder, like a meat grinder dungeon, it's like a super hard, mechanically taxing and challenging adventure or dungeon that adventure takes you through. The whole point being that like it's not so much telling a story at that point as it is like winning, it's surviving, it's beating this dungeon. It's a challenge in that way and less of a storytelling thing, which we tend to be storytellers.
A lot of traps or encounters tend to be kind of like one-hit kills. Very
deadly, very unforgiving.
Yes, puzzles are extremely unforgiving. They tend to be mazes. They tend to be sort of tricks in and of themselves. And they're essentially designed to kill player characters, and quite often to kill a lot of player characters. And there have been some pre-built adventures off and on that were very intentionally built that way. They tend to be just sort of specific. They tend to sort of just be loose stories bolted onto the front end of a super brutal dungeon.
Yeah.
But those have by and large remained some of the more popular, at least better known pre-built adventures. And Wizards has reprinted a lot of old pre-built adventures in collections.
There's one that Costco ran back in the day that all I remember is it was supposed to be an unwinnable dungeon, and my shadow monk basically stole the MacGuffin and left everyone to die, and because of teleportation movement shenanigans was able to outrun the like unbeatable bosses that showed up at the entrance to the cave to basically, it's like, it was the most hand-wavy BS into a dungeon I've ever seen, because it's like, you survived the brutal dungeon that should have been unwinnable. Now here's an even more unwinnable fight to just make sure you can't win. And I was like, later. But, yes.
And, Tales from the Yawning Portal, I believe even the Saltmarsh book, not only it added a bunch of, like, kind of nautical-themed stuff, but part of what it did was stitch together a bunch of older slow modules and adventures. Pre-builts are great because of the detail that the creators tend to build into them. Everything tends to be really tight-knit. You've got all your stat blocks there. You tend to be working in very detailed places that have a lot going on and have a lot of NPCs to meet and a lot of mini games to interact with and stuff like that. And they tend to be relatively complex as far as multiple factions, kind of a lot of different people with different goals. And Dragon Heist in particular has like a whole slew of villains, and you're not even necessarily supposed to pick day one who the main villain is. It's kind of built so, not necessarily for replay value, but so that there's just lots of options baked into it to begin with. And I think the systems have gotten better at supporting that, and the writers of those pre-builts have gotten better at building that complexity into them.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of information to take from them. Mm-hmm. And that's something we can get on to later about, like, another very positive thing about them is just kind of is cutting them open and pulling the pieces you want out of them. However, back to the kind of original question of, like, what do you see as the most successful pre-built that you think we ran? The one at least the most enjoyable for the group?
I think Curse of Strahd, even though Matty G blew up the whole party. We killed 2 mayors, and it came to a like sort of bizarrely abrupt end. I think the characters in it, the whole cast of characters we had were great. I felt like people were RPing well through it, and it didn't necessarily feel all that constraining.
I would agree with that.
Similarly, Dragon Heist is kind of up there as well for some of that. We had it was again just like kind of a good cast of characters. People took their characters in interesting directions, which ended up having a lot of a lot of repercussions. And like it's fun to have elements of the sort of conspiracy board. With the string, which I think like the first half of that campaign did really well. But I do really, and there's elements of Tomb of Annihilation that I really liked, in particular, like its exploration elements and the sort of preparing for expeditions. I have fairly big issues with all of them, and really my big one comes down to them feeling constraining. So since you've run a lot of them, I'd kind of be interested to know, like, I guess which one you liked running the best.
I think that it's kind of a cheating answer. The one I enjoyed running the most is also my favorite one, and the one I think was the most successful, and that is the first half of Tomb of Annihilation. I think that Tomb of Annihilation was an exceptionally written world and area to tell stories in. Cholt was super cool and interesting and so different from what I was used to seeing of, like, oh, we're going to the Sword Coast again, woohoo, but the issue was the time clock that they put on it, and this is the biggest bit of advice I think for successfully running pre-builts that have been lessons learned the hard way by me specifically in a lot of DMs. So if you haven't run very many, learn it from hearing me now instead of making these mistakes yourself. Don't feel the reason that they feel constraining is because it feels like you should follow them to the letter, and you need to adjust and change things, and you need to be able to kind of feel what's working well and lean into it and go more in depth in it and make those changes on the fly for a overall better experience. I think that Tomb of Annihilation, even if it ended the exact same way it did, if it did so about 20 sessions later, and I'd actually let you guys take your time exploring Cholt, it would have been our favorite pre-built we've ever done. Because Cholt had so many cool spots to go, so many fun adventures and expeditions to go on, but the way the adventure is written, it's trying to funnel you to that dungeon ever since the very beginning of it. And that time constraint is like, oh, there's these pirates over here, there's this dinosaur race I want to go do, there's this rumor I've heard of this, there's this guide who wants to have me to help him reclaim his dwarven hold, and there's all these cool stories, and it's like, you have time to do 1, maybe 2 of those things, and then you have to be going to the dungeon. And that's what ruined that adventure for us, and if I were to go back and run it now, I would have taken that time constraint away or limited it much more, because the world itself was much more interesting than the dungeon at the end of it.
Well, and the time constraint is exactly why Tomb of Annihilation isn't necessarily on my favorites list. I mean, really, yeah, because of exactly what you've just said. There are so many side quests that get teased and that you get access to, because not only does every guide available kind of have their own thing going on that you can get involved in. But there's if you go kill these pirates, you'll get a ship. Or if you, go and map out this area, you get this cool reward. And as well as just the expeditions being interesting by themselves, having to prep for them and, using resources in sort of strategic ways to get sort of as far and accomplish as much as you can. There's the dinosaur races, there's the Colosseum, and players immediately want to get their own dinosaurs and participate in the dinosaur races. Or, I want to train a combat T-Rex to fight in the arena, and we can ride him through the jungle. They introduce all of these elements, and they're all, fascinating, and players want to do all of them, and they want to get involved with the merchant princes and all of this stuff, and immediately, just forces you on down the road, and you just don't have time to do hardly any of it. We needed to go on expeditions because we needed the money, and we needed to begin to learn how to explore Chult, because that's kind of a whole thing unto itself. But we do one or two expeditions, and our employer's just really pressuring us to get on down the road and go, because statistically that character is on a clock.
That's mechanically this person is withering away, and I even fudged the numbers a little bit on how that worked to make sure that you guys had enough time to do some interesting stuff, but I wish I threw that time clock out more or less altogether. I would describe it, the perfect metaphor for this to me is bringing a kid to an arcade and showing them the entire array of prizes and being look at all these awesome things. Now here's a Chinese finger trap. Put it on and figure out how to get it off. And that's all you get to you get to look at all this stuff, look how neat it is, but this is the toy you have to play with. And you either learn how it works and get it off, or you sit there and struggle with it, and it's not very fun. And the kind of humor of it is fun to a child for a moment, but after about a minute or two, you're over it. And that's what the dungeon was.
I mean, it's unfortunate that what's at the end of all that is this incredibly brutal dungeon that's designed to not only play off of how players tend to react in certain situations with the goal of killing them, or just being so statistically brutal, like an invisible beholder. It's just if you're fighting an invisible beholder as a boss in your homebrew campaign, that is going to be a very difficult fight depending on how your party is built. Probably for any party. It's worse when it's deep within a dungeon that has been sapping resources, sapping hit points, and there's really you don't get anything from killing it. It doesn't progress the story, it hardly progresses the dungeon. It's just sort of needlessly brutal. Some people like that, some DMs like running that style of game. We've never been that way. And it does feel like somebody showing you all these super cool things and then really quickly making you run down a hallway knowing that there's a guy waiting around a corner at the end with a bat. You know what I mean? It's just
look at all the cool stuff down there. Now run as fast as you can into the shadows over there. Don't worry about my friend Reggie. He's just going to be playing with you when you get there.
It's just, don't, whether you know the guy with the bat is there or not, you don't want to do it. But you can't stay here. And Chult is, to kind of talk about pre-built in general, Chult is an awesome thing to take wholesale.
Oh yeah.
Stick in your own campaign and ignore the time crunch and ignore the big tomb at the end of it. Let players explore the big lost city and
instead of have the tomb there. Have just the Yuan Ti that are in there. That was an interesting infiltrating the Yuan Ti citadel and doing all that. That's the quest right there.
And there are plenty of other mini dungeons in the hidden city that have interesting traps and interesting puzzles. There's no point in forcing your players to run there as quickly as possible and then just murdering them once they're there. I'm not going to call it a misstep because it is exactly what it was supposed to be. It just really takes a lot of the interest away from pre-built in general.
Especially for a group that plays like us.
Because it doesn't let you actually play around with all the interesting, fun toys that you should be able to do. In our very first campaign, we had a bizarre session, 3 or 4 sessions in, where we were, a bunch of like slave gladiators trying to earn our freedom, and we're just cut loose for a day because of this big festival. We're like given a meager allowance, and it's literally just this big session of like wrestling and archery competitions and gambling and drinking and meeting NPCs that come back around later and just like, buying a couple things and earning some cool loot. And it's in a much smaller scale, sort of exactly what Chult is. Of like, here's just a place to explore with a bunch of fun things to do and some cool prizes to win. The Pork Festival would not have been very good if you'd cut us loose for that and then just like...
Well, but you gotta fight in 30 minutes after you get there. You gotta go and be a part of it.
You can do one thing, and that's it, and I'll tantalize you with all this other interesting stuff, and you don't get to participate in it. We got to do everything at the festival because you had prepared all of it and wanted us to play around with it all. And that's sort of, to some degrees, what pre-builts should be. They should have a lot of interesting stuff going on, and your players should experience it all. So once we kind of hit that turn and Tomb of Annihilation kind of ended, it just kind of started this feeling of like, I don't know if I really want to play pre-builts. Like, I was having a great time. I was thinking pre-builts were the shit. Now I'm like, I don't really know if I want to keep going. And then like the other pre-builts that we played sort of after that, like Dragon Heist in particular, was good. It raises its own weird questions about the Sword Coast and sort of reinforces why I would rather play in a homebrew world. But it does some of that stuff right. There's a little bit of a crunch.
There is.
But it's not as bad. You're kind of given a tavern, which giving players a home base is always a good idea. And there's lots of interesting NPCs to explore. There's, kind of all this intrigue and stuff going on, and it balances at least the timing a little bit better.
And I would argue that part of it too is Dragon Heist seemed better than Tomb of Annihilation because I felt more open and able to change a lot of what they said to do in it.
Right.
I think I matured as somebody running pre-builts from one to the next, and it was like a lesson hard learned from Tomb of Annihilation that I made quite a few changes, and I adjusted time clocks, and I adjusted things to where part of what I didn't like about Tomb of Annihilation is also part of what's very interesting about it, which is you kind of choose a season and a villain, and the villain is related to a season. Dragon Heist is this villain and the season, and that can greatly change the story, and you can run it different ways multiple times if you really wanted to, though I would argue that would still be the same story. It's just anyway. So instead, I kind of did that, but I still used a lot of the other major villains, and I used a lot of the other stuff that normally you wouldn't be using because it's not the villain for this one. And I had one that was kind of the guy, but I had all of them play a role, and it made it much more interesting. And I also took it a little bit differently in that I was very open to the idea of PvP at the end of it. And that's what it kind of turned into, is like the array of characters that were made were kind of diametrically opposed at certain points in morality and decision making. And I knew it was a pre-built, and I didn't really care what happened at the end of it. So I was like, this could be a fun experiment and to see how it. And I think it ended, as far as a PvP ending can end, pretty well. But that raises my biggest point when running pre-builts, which is do not run them cover to cover without making changes and without making adaptations based on your play group's play style and what's sticking, what people are enjoying. If people are loving dinosaur races in Chult, don't say, no, you can't wait here long enough to have your own dinosaur and take part in the races because Grandma Yada Yada's withering away up there and she's got to be saved, so get out there and go die in a dungeon. Like that, just don't do that. And
the story doesn't feel like it has a lot of buy-in for exactly the reason, especially if the whole party cycles over by the end of it.
Yeah.
Because it's a meat grinder. Like, why do all these new people care whether that lady dies or not? Like, none of these people have ever met her.
And also with anything that takes place in the Sword Coast, and our biggest gripe with the Sword Coast is always been, it's super rich with NPCs, and they're all 25th level super badass heroes. Why the hell is my 3rd level bard out here solving the problem that is this 20th level evil wizard trying to steal from the city? Why isn't the 12 NPCs I've met on this adventure that are all these big badass heroes going and kicking this guy's door down and solving the
Especially
problem?
when it's like literally their job.
And it's literally their city, and they're the protectors of the city, and they're like, no, I'm much too busy standing in this tower waiting to divulge plot. You go fight the all-powerful, omnipotent evil.
Who cares if there's a war in the streets between several different evil gangs trying to get a hold of a ludicrous amount of money?
Yeah. I have to stand here and wait for people to show up so I can give them quests to deal with that.
It feels more like, some NPCs in video games than it does tabletop RPGs. And the nice thing about tabletop RPGs is you're not constrained by those, like what the creators of the game programmed into it. You're much more limited by, how well you RP, the decisions you choose to make, and to some degrees, like, how well you can bullshit your way through certain situations. And, like I kind of mentioned earlier, my biggest problem with pre-builts is just that they feel constraining. It feels like there's less of a world to explore. It's a small area that's very tightly packed with interesting things and interesting people, and everything beyond that is the sort of it's the muddy long distance textures in a video game, and if you manage to get out of the boundary of the game,
it's a pixelated tree.
Yeah,
everything around that map is a pixelated tree on a pixelated mountain.
Exactly. It's and by and large, homebrew worlds tend to avoid that just because, the DM is drawing in trees as fast as you're walking past the boundaries of what he had planned, and then just coming up with weird little ideas to start to populate the world. Pre-builts, and really one of the, I think the best place for pre-builts, and I do think it is a lot of people use them, are DMs who aren't entirely comfortable with building their own world, or for people who are just getting into the game. If you're trying to learn a system for the first time, pre-builts are awesome because it gives you great guidelines for kind of making characters. It gives you all your stats, it gives you all your villains, and it lets you and your play group learn a system very well. And and they do that phenomenally well.
Especially the first couple pre-builts that came out, and don't even get me started on the opinions of the first couple pre-builts that came out for most people. Because if we want to talk about nerd anger, there's a lot of vehement hatred towards some of the early kind of dragon-based stories that they came out with. And it's these people who've been playing RPGs even like I played since 3.5. These are people who played 2nd edition, 1st edition, and they're like, this is just boring old generic fantasy BS. Like this isn't an interesting story. And it's like, the point of like the starter adventure is so that a person who's never played D&D can grab it and by the end of that be like, oh, I know what D&D is now. And those, I think, do an exceptional job of that.
Well, and a lot of people, especially now as we're sort of reaching this heyday of tabletop RPGs, and there are a lot of really super talented people out there running games or creating worlds. I mean, you look at people like Matt Mercer, to name the big one that everybody thinks of as far as like creating this like rich world and telling his own story. Brendan Lee Mulligan's another excellent example of just like a super talented person running running really many tabletop RPGs. A lot of people look at that kind of stuff and they're like, well, I can't create a world because look at all the stuff that goes into it. I'll just run the pre-builts. Like, I'll just run stuff in Sword Coast. Like, I don't have the writing chops. I don't have the imagination to, like, create my own world. It's really not all that hard. I think a lot of people have to get kind of past that stigma of, like, it's like, but I'm not a writer. I'm not a creator. And, like, it's really super satisfying to have players explore the things that you've created. And that's one of the things that Homebrew has going for it over pre-builts. Just kind of across the board, although obviously like pre-builts remain an excellent source to just rip whole chunks out of whole sections you like, character stat blocks, stuff like that.
And I would argue run pre-builts like you would run a homebrew. Basically, treat the pre-built book as your notes you would have written as a DM for your homebrew world. And at that point, whenever players throw a wrench in and they go a different way, don't, and this will be, especially if you're newer, this will be very good exercise for you, whether it goes well or not. Don't do the like, it's not in the book, I don't know what to do. Go with it. If they go to a different part of the city than you have a note on in Dragon Heist, come up with what's going on over there. And then at that point, you have this more sandboxy feeling. I think that the pre-builts that do well, or the parts of pre-builts that do well, tend to be the sandboxy ones.
I think
because it's just a normal homebrew world that has all the hard work done for you, in that like it's got these in-depth notes and things that are already there, and the player's getting to go and explore and experience it. That's very good. I think that Curse of Strahd is a really popular pre-built, and a lot of that has to do with like there is this main story, but it's not really this super straight line that players have to follow in order to complete it. And you can use that. And you can just run pre-built straight up, but run them like the book is your notes, and you are running a homebrew world, and you can adjust and change and do things. And honestly, when kind of translate over from pre-built to homebrew here, Rob, like you said, Rob from pre-builts constantly like take encounters, take whole adventure arcs if you want, dungeons, puzzles, all that kind of stuff. And if you're somebody who's running a bunch of homebrew worlds, I would say that it's still very worth it to get those books a lot of the time because of that stuff, if only just for some of the NPCs. And this is a little behind the screen, like some like bosses or main villains of homebrew worlds that I've run are taken directly from and reskinned from villains and stuff for some of the other stories and arcs of pre-builts. Like especially like I think if you're looking for a rogues gallery of humanoid NPCs to be helpers or enemies to the party, get Dragon Heist. Dragon Heist has it has this whole soiree of like kind of upper or kind of like mid-level like rogue-esque kind of criminals that are these like Zentarim agent kind of people that you can work with. There's like 6 or 7 of them that like kind of run the gamut of different classes, and all of a sudden now you have this like I want a cool threatening bounty hunter that's going after my characters. I'm going to take this orc strength-based archer that they have in this, and he's going to be this cool merc bounty hunter that's going after my players. Take those stats, throw it into your world. Absolutely. That's like it's a gold mine of that kind of stuff, and that's where the work is done for you in a way that actually saves you time. I think that you have to read the book to know the story, but the like pieces that you can find and like in it, that's what'll save you time if you're somebody who's constrained on time for prep work. Because now I don't have to spend the next hour coming up with NPC stats. I'll just take this out and I'll adjust the race on it, or I'll give him this other spell I wanted him to have, and now it's my villain for my campaign.
And, you know, the smaller pre-built adventures are excellent to just steal because you think this dungeon's neat. So when the players get to that point, you're just running them through that little pre-built dungeon. You know, those big sort of collections of smaller pre-built modules. I mean, that's really what they're designed for, is for you to just bolt them into existing stories. And they don't necessarily have to have these long-term grand consequences. It's neat puzzles for the players to do. It's neat encounters for them to get in, a little bit of loot at the end of it, and that's kind of... you know, and then that's just where it goes, and then they're back out into, you know, they're spit back out into the homebrew world at large. You know, they go through the loading screen between the pre-built dungeon and the homebrew world, and then they're just back to exploring like they were. That's really what they were designed to do. Obviously, like, you know, if you decide to just throw everything to the wind except for, you know, like the 3 core rule books, you know, or in something like Savage Worlds or Star Wars, just like maybe 1 core rule book, then you're left with a homebrew world. You have to get to.
You will likely, if you're someone who wants to be running a game, you will happily enjoy the process of
building everything yourself. And that's not necessarily like every single stat block. That's why the monster manual's there. You know, that's why Savage Worlds has a little bestiary tucked into the back of it of just here's some basic stat blocks of stuff you're likely to run into, or just kind of a catch-all. modify these as you need to. And then the stories are entirely your own. The worlds are entirely your own. It does sound like a lot of work, and it really can be, and often is, especially if you're trying to get sort of true detail into a world. But I think the payoff tends to be much higher for a well-run homebrew versus a well-run pre-built.
I would agree with that. I think the biggest hurdle for a lot of people, if it's like your first time running a game, then this might be different. A lot of it's just like, I don't know what I'm doing yet, so I need this structure and help. But if for people who have run a little bit, they're at least comfortable with the rules. I think the biggest hurdle that a lot of people have is they fear that their own creativity will be lacking, that they won't be able to come up with an interesting enough story, an interesting enough villain, an interesting enough world to inhabit. And I think that creative confidence is like the biggest bar to entry for homebrew world creation. And everybody's creative. Anyone who doesn't feel like they're creative is just not confident in their creativity. It's not that they're not creative. Every single person is. That's how the human brain works. Even somebody who's very robotic in their thought patterns is still going to be a very creative person when it really comes down to it. Because we're all human beings and we've all had nothing but media and stories and things funneled into our brain, and all creativity in terms of creating a world is us regurgitating that with our own spin on it. And you need not fear the process, because I think the best example of this, like I read the first big 5th edition game I ran we have so much nostalgia and so much love for, was, to put it quite bluntly, a horrific fantasy ripoff of the Spartacus TV series for the first 10 to 20 sessions.
What?
Yeah, exactly.
What?
This.
It was based off of the ancient Mediterranean the whole time?
What? It's like, I was watching the series as I was running the first couple sessions, and one for one stealing stuff from it and putting a little spin on it and making it famous.
Or let's talk about the time you and I binge watched the first 3 seasons of Vikings and went, hey, let's run a Vikings campaign. Like, let's do just like something like Norse.
Yeah, and it went great, and we had a ton of fun running it. Yeah, I had a ton of fun running it, and it was a very fun game. So, like, I think a lot of people's lack of confidence there, it's because they're like, I need to materialize from nothing a full world with plot and story, and you have so many tools just from your own experiences and media you enjoy.
Well, and that's like when I'm world building, whether it's for writing or tabletop RPGs, it's always like, I have an idea for a character that I think is kind of cool, or I'm watching a movie and it's like, this plot point of this film is interesting, but what if it was more like this? And then you just start building everything around it. And like, a lot of people are like, I don't know, the bartender's name is Bob. Like, that's fine if you're that person and that's just like how you're running games. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But there are like, I'm a huge fan of fantasynamegenerators.com. Because there are literally thousands of generators, and Emily, the lady who runs it, is very nice. She's just really very friendly and is constantly adding new stuff for existing worlds. Everything from Avatar: The Last Airbender through to just about every species in Star Wars.
Pretty much every species. Having recently completed a Star Wars campaign, pretty much every species in Star Wars.
And to just even sort of generic fantasy stuff. And it's all completely free of copyright. You can use any of it in your own works, assuming it hasn't been, the name you're using hasn't been, copyrighted or trademarked by something else. But, you need a name for a tavern? There's a generator for that. You need a name for a bookstore, or a town, or a kingdom, or you need a name that sounds faintly dwarven, or a name that sounds faintly elven, or you really like the name style of the original Robert E. Howard Conan works. Those generators are all there in one place, and that's not including every other website that has name generators, tavern generators, map generators that are just free to use. Most of them work instantaneously with a click of a button. And having just a couple of your favorites of those up in tabs on your laptop or on your phone while running a campaign is, spoiler alert, literally how Erickson and I run campaigns.
Seriously. Literally when I'm prepping for, before people show up for Star Wars, what I'm doing is I'm opening up a web document. I'm opening up OBS and setting up our recording setup. I then open up Google Chrome. I open up my notes in a Google Doc. I open up Fantasy Name Generator for Star Wars humans usually, so I have a generic name to quickly pull from. And then I pull up a spreadsheet thing I found that has a bunch of rule cheat sheet stuff on it.
Yeah.
And that's my prep for getting everything set up, because having that resource to go to, so you're not like, Bob, is invaluable and easy.
And it's totally fine to be like, to kind of pause there and to be like, it's like, give me a second and I'll find you his name. Like, you know, like, it's like, or just even say his name is really slowly while staring at the screen is fine. Like,
and your players might not know that you're not scrolling through your notes to find the name of the bartender.
And like,
and they won't care.
And have players write it down or just jot it down yourself. And then like, all right, that's the bartender in this tavern is named this. Both of those names came from a random generator. Who cares?
And now it's notes.
Now it's notes. And now it's you have something to reference. Like, so much of running homebrew worlds is at times being able to think quickly and come up with stuff on the spot. But the stuff you actually truly have to just like react that quickly to is more like the way people are reacting to the weird thing the players just did, or like what the repercussions of the players' actions are going to be. And you run into those exact same problems running pre-builts. And quite often they're harder with pre-builts because players break things. Period. It's, you know, it's sovereign glue. Sooner or later, something or someone important ends up stuck to someone or something else important. Or someone or something inconvenient is a good way to put it. Like, players, like, that is so much of my prep work is like, do I make this a part of the world? Because if I make it a part of the world, there's a chance that players get a hold of it, which means I need to just already have in my mind that the players have this thing.
What would they do?
How bad is that?
How do they break it?
You know, that's why, like, I didn't give you guys the big magical MacGuffin orb in my campaign until literally the end, when I have another character there to be like, hand me that thing. Because, like, it's like, I've decided all this cool lore stuff about what this does. Will this just kill a player character? Probably. And, like, players break everything they touch. They kill people. They just completely ignore story hooks. I mean, it's Tristan's wonderful. Are you going to respond to the letter, or are you going to be an asshole? It's just, like, that is player characters. And pre-builds don't really prepare for that very well, quite often. Pre-builds tend to be a little more inflexible in that regard. That's one of the beautiful things about a homebrew world with homebrew NPCs. It's like, well, this is the story now, because the players killed those two guys, and I wasn't expecting that.
Going back to pre-builts, that's why I say that run pre-builts like they're the notes for your homebrew world, is because players are going to do that stuff, and you're going to have to. And I think that that's, for newer DMs, pre-builts can be very useful for giving you that groundwork and kind of sharpening your knife, kind of getting you better at that thinking on the fly, where the kind of creative process is done for you, so you just get to focus on your during play, like, oh, they did this, now what do I do? Because I got a couple examples here. Dragon Heist. One of our characters happened to be a pretty evil, murderous bastard, and he was overall like in the best interest of the party most of the time. But all of a sudden, until the end,
that really depends on the character you're talking
the specific character in the party. This is very true.
My character wouldn't necessarily, and me as a player of that character, wouldn't necessarily agree with that sentence you just said.
That's fair. But all of a sudden, that murderous guy who's like, you know, got some deity or evil thing that he's working for.
Blood for the blood god.
Blood for the blood god goes and like strangles an NPC in a quiet room. Brother has awoken.
Is the printer about to print something? That'd be interesting. Just start spitting out terrified messages or warnings about
cries for help from us in the future. Anyway, he goes and smothers some NPC that maybe had important information. Now you have to decide which NPC has that important information, so the players can still get it.
I look at it as the Bethesda thing, you know, where it's like
this quite player often doesn't stay dead, right?
Or quite often Bethesda has, you know, backups for their backups. You know, like, I accidentally, you know, like, let the sheriff of this town get killed. now how do I get the free house in Megaton? Oh, well, his son shows up with the key later. Be like, hey, my dad wanted you to have this.
Yes.
Like,
You either have to have that, or you have that moment where you stab somebody, they fall over, and it says, yada yada is essential, they will wake up, and then they get back up. And you don't want to have that in your D&D world.
You really need to be careful about being that hand-wavy about important NPCs surviving. Because, by and large, because quite often players... There can absolutely be things behind the scenes. You can do death saves behind the scenes and not divulge that information. But we've been playing a lot of Divinity Original Sin 2 recently and having a great time of it. And the game, we decided to, because the game let us, rip the face off of an early game villain because we had the object to do it, and we're just like, we're going to steal his face. Take that, bastard. And so we, kill him. We steal his face.
Rip his face off. It's in my inventory right now.
We go through a loading screen, and immediately an NPC's just like, oh, yeah, Bishop Alexander. He survived that fight with you guys. He's down in the hold.
He's in the hold.
And we're just like,
oh,
no. Does he have a face? It's just... that game, entirely because mechanically it let us do something, ran itself into a sort of funny storytelling position. And that can be great in your campaigns if you know that this guy that they just used the face ripper on survived. That is a great moment of oh yeah, somebody ripped his face off. It was horrible, but he survived.
He's survived, unfortunately, and is recovering.
The players just being like, "Well, who could have done that? Wow, yeah, feel terrible for him. Oh boy,
was that still in the bag of holding? Put it at the bottom of the bag of holding."
Your cleric holds it up to show to the rest of the party. But you need to be careful about being hand-wavy. Homebrew worlds let you be hand-wavy in better ways, or be hand-wavy in less, sort of truly constrictive ways.
If you're running a pre-built, you cannot treat it as gospel. You cannot take every word and not be like, I can't change this. This is a blanket statement for every book Wizards of the Coast releases. You can't look at any single rule and be like, I have to follow this to the letter. If in play, it makes for a worse play experience for you and your group, change it, remove it, take it and repurpose it in another way. There's nothing saying you can't, and in fact, they constantly talk about how you should take their rules and change them. And that's the same for pre-builds.
Well, just look at the homebrew community, for really any system. It's just so alive and vibrant with people making their own settings, making their own adventures, making their own classes and their own equipment, especially magic items in D&D, because you should be modifying and bolting other stuff onto the system where you can, and that's really hard to do with pre-builds. Chult is such a cool little area, or not little, it's such a cool chunk of the world to explore, and its exploration mechanics are really, really compelling. But it just, by the very nature of it, is so constraining that it's just automatically changing your perspective of the whole thing. It's because you just get to only see it sort of at this dead sprint past it. And that's the thing with building a homebrew world, is you want your players to explore all the stuff that you've created. They may not. There's going to be stuff they miss. There's going to be NPCs they don't talk to. I loved having Bavarula show up and just wondering whether or not you guys would actually go and talk to her. There was one time where I was like, this will be a very interesting conversation because of where she's just shown up. And you guys were just like, nope. Nope. Not talking to her.
Not today.
So it's so you never got any explanation as to how she's there. And players are going to do that. But if you build something like the Rendaham Pork Festival or Chult, you want the players to get to bet on, these crazy races going on, and get to do all the side quests and get the loot for them, and get, especially if they're getting a base of operations or stuff. It's just really a shame, and there's really almost no way to do it better. It's just a shame that pre-builts feel that constraining, and that's just because, they are what they are. They're trying to just build a world and tell a story, and it has to be that complete package in order to be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it ultimately gives the DM and the players a little less freedom, which is, like, that's just my issue with them. Like, and again, you're absolutely right, like, steal from them. Take everything you want out of them and bolt it into your own worlds. Bolt them onto your own stories. Because then you get the freedom of a true homebrew world, along with these really cool little set pieces and these really detailed little things to explore and do.
Yeah, just rob from them freely and mercilessly. There's a lot to take from them.
Be the Robin Hood of tabletop RPGs. Steal from the pre-built and give to the homebrew.
Exactly. Rob from the pre-built and give to the homebrew. It's very true. And another bit of like cheerleading, I guess, for people a little bit intimidated by the thought of running homebrew. The other very nice thing about homebrews in terms of like prep work and stuff is you get to be so intentional with your prep work with homebrews. When you're preparing to run a pre-built, you kind of have to know everything to do anything. Whereas in a homebrew, you have to have a broad picture of what your idea is, and then you get to just start throwing poop at the wall and seeing which turd sticks. Like, it's really all it is. Like, it's just you have a couple ideas, and you're like, oh, that one stuck, players are liking this. Now I get to put a bunch of effort into this. And, then my player's making this kind of a character. Oh, I had the idea of this kind of, they're making a knight. I had an idea of a knightly order. I get to now work with them and put a bunch of effort into this instead of effort into everything.
Absolutely, especially as you're setting up to run a campaign, absolutely leverage your players to help with the prep work. Mm-hmm. Get this character, that's playing the rogue to help figure out sort of what the Thieves Guild or guilds look like. Mm-hmm. Get this knight to create the knightly order. This character that's, sort of disgraced nobility. Like, what's that family situation like? Where does he come from? Like, why is he disgraced? Why did this druid have to leave her forest? What is that forest like? Where is it? What's she looking for? And all of that is just adding detail into the world and doing work that you then don't have to do. Mm-hmm.
And you can't do that with pre-builts.
No.
You just can't, because you can't be like, hey, read the next chapter for me and tell me what happens, because then they know everything.
Well, and it's just, and really players are a very good thing to talk about when you're talking about pre-builts versus homebrew. Mm-hmm. It's unless the players have a very in-depth knowledge of the world that this pre-built is taking place in. And that's going to be the case for some of the more common worlds, like pre-built worlds in Dungeons & Dragons, especially for play groups that play a lot in that world or almost exclusively in that world or have read all the books. But it's really hard. It's much harder for players to make characters truly attached to pre-built worlds. Mm-hmm. It's much easier in homebrew worlds to really ingrain characters' backstories either in the events of the world or just in its places, and then draw on a lot of that as the game is moving forward. The
way that I would word it is that for pre-built adventures, pre-built stories, the players have to fit their square. They have to find a version of their characters that a square to fit into the square hole on the box. Whereas in a homebrew, your players can make their characters, and then you build the box that those characters will fit into. Mm-hmm. You have that freedom at that point to say, well, I have this world I had an idea of. There wasn't an order of druids, but there certainly could be, and this person really wants to be from an order of druids. Hey, come up with an order of druids. I'll tell you where they exist.
I'm working on a campaign right now where Erickson created a lot of the detail of one of the factions because I had some loose ideas in that direction, at least of sort of this type of people existing. And then you were just like, I want to play this character. I want this to be the whole thing, like with their family. And it's like, cool. What you're doing is building a fairly major part of this world now. Go for it. Give me their names. Tell me like how some of this works. And that has now ended up being more interesting and more detailed than I would have probably made it myself. Just because it's somebody else's full focus, sort of character and storytelling wise, attached to one thing, whereas my storytelling focus is spread over, a lot of the things going on in this homebrew world. But it's also fine to say that homebrew world is kind of a mix of The Witcher and Dragon Age.
Yeah.
We had a long conversation about how it turns out those worlds are
the same.
Essentially the same.
fucking same.
Fruit. It's like those two are kind of a natural fit for each other, doing something sort of in that flavor. I love the Dragon Age world, especially like a lot of the lore with the dwarves is just
that's why every dwarf faction I've ever made is just the dwarves from Dragon Age.
It's like a lot of their lore and like both the people who are like working hard to fit like the sort of traditional dwarven culture and people like Varric who are kind of like, man, fuck it. Like
there's a reason he's a dwarf without a beard.
Yes, are just like both are very interesting, and both of those worlds are just kind of complex enough to support a lot of that. Mm-hmm. But that makes my work, as far as homebrew goes, a little bit easier because I have a lot of the aesthetics in mind. I have a lot of the sort of relationships in mind. Like, I know kind of just what I want the world to look and feel like, which means I need to put some effort into making the world look and feel that way. But I'm not creating this entirely new universe completely from scratch. It's heavily influenced by the stories that I've seen and the stories that I like, and that's all of homebrew.
That is
like that is it's all the medieval or the ancient Mediterranean. It's all just medieval Europe. You know, and even your map was heavily influenced by the original map of the map of the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. But it just gives immediately this like cultural differences to each group. It gives stylistic differences to everything, and that makes it very interesting for the players to explore the world, because dealing with this much more sort of Carthaginian or North African culture, or this much more sort of Greek culture versus the very sort of Roman Empyrean like Dragon Empire. Mm-hmm. They all have this different flair and feel. It makes the world feel alive. But it's not like you had to meticulously create each part of that. A lot of that's just kind of done for you.
Yeah, and it's just historical context applied to a fantasy setting, and it's like, just like you said, everything that gets created in a homebrew setting is your spin on media and stuff that you've taken in the past. And so you can take a lot of that like pressure and self-doubt out of the equation entirely, because that's what every person running a game is doing with their homebrew setting. And the big help or the big like boon of this is that like character buy-in, character connection, players helping in the world building process, all of that. You can't have your player read through the pre-built and like take out their Sharpie and edit a section of it to make it fit better with the character they had in mind. You can read through the whole thing, they can tell you character, and you can kind of and should adjust things about the homebrew or the pre-built to make their character fit more in it or whatever. But you can't have that same control, and you can only do so much to kind of smooth those edges to make their character fit into the mold of that story instead of you deciding the mold yourself.
Right.
And that's where like experienced groups, especially kind of tight-knit groups, I think that we're pretty lucky in the fact that while we've had some people come and go or be here more or less regularly, like we've got a pretty good core group of people that we play with consistently or have played with consistently at different times. And so we know each other well, and we know the kind of characters we like to play, and we're good at having those conversations about like, oh, I've been really wanting to do this. And it's like, oh, that would actually work perfectly for this campaign I'm coming up with. You just need to kind of fit in this way. And oh, that doesn't really fit in what I was doing, but it could if we introduce this faction. Now your character beautifully blends in.
Well, and you and I tend to do it a lot just because we're both game masters, and by and large, if something's being run in our play group, it's going to be either you or me. Mm-hmm. So that, just lets us sort of talk freely about character concepts or character secrets, and help to sort of fit them into either worlds that somebody's working on or like upcoming campaigns, and begin to sort of build a lot of that detail in. Players want to have that buy-in. Players love building a little piece of the world, and it gives the game master something to threaten, as well as NPCs quite often to draw on, references to make that'll make the rogue player kind of pull up his hood and turn away.
Conspicuous.
It just gives that amount of detail, and you can get it in making characters for pre-builts. It's just much harder.
It is. And I think that pre-builts have their place. I think that pre-builts, we've kind of gone for newer groups or newer DMs. There can be a lot of help with running pre-builts. It can be a good place to kind of start sharpening your skills. There's times where it can be a fun change of pace. If you've been running a bunch of homebrew worlds and want to just jump into something right afterwards, you don't have a good idea at that moment. You don't have something inspiring you, but the pre-built that just came out sounds super cool to you. So you're like, oh yeah, sure, let's run that. Let's try it. That's always fine. Just never run the pre-built with the mindset that this is gospel. I have to follow everything in this to the letter. Be open to adjustment, be willing to change and adapt, and see the parts that are good and fun and really grab hold of those. And be open to going and looking. If you're like new to running games and want to use pre-builts to help, there are so many resources specifically for that to help you with the work too. There's entire forums about advice for running Curse of Strahd. There's entire packages of like additional things to add or things to change that are just like, Curse of Strahd was almost perfect, but here's why I don't think it was. Look at how I changed all this stuff. Here's an entire resource pack that you can use. All this stuff exists out there. Use it and enjoy it and have fun with it. If you're a super experienced group, if you're a group that's super tight-knit, I think you'll oftentimes find pre-builts lacking and want more from them. And it's on you at that point as the game master to either change them enough that the story can allow for that, or to do what we talked about, and that's just gut them and take everything good from it and use it elsewhere.
And pre-builts tend to introduce interesting mechanics, or they tend to have interesting aesthetics, as well as, even for experienced players, pre-builts are an excellent way to learn new game systems.
Yeah.
If you've only played Dungeons & Dragons, but you're maybe interested in dipping your toes into Star Wars, there are plenty of starter adventures or in like sort of entire starter campaigns that are an excellent way to just learn how to stat out characters, learn how the mechanics work in a slightly more controlled fashion. Same goes for Savage Worlds. I mean, really just across, or if you only play Savage Worlds and are interested in playing D&D, one of the sort of low-level pre-built modules are going to be a great way to just get comfortable with the mechanics before you start telling all your own stories in it.
I ran 2 Star Wars pre-builts that I had slightly adjusted before I ever came up with my own Star Wars story. And I'm a giant Star Wars nerd. I love Star Wars. I know more about Star Wars than I should probably, which means like I had especially now with the research I've done with other stuff. Like I had such a huge well of knowledge to draw from to create a world, but it just took some of that pressure off me when I was still learning the system. And these systems are complex. That's part of what makes them good. And so taking some of that pressure off is a really good idea when you're first starting out, and to give you that confidence, sharpen that knife, build those skills, and then you get to then apply it and really kind of get the full result out of it later on.
And players aren't going to mind running a one-shot in a pre-built if it's to learn a new system or to play around with a new mechanic. They really do have their place. I tend to agree that by and large, the more experienced your play group is, the less mileage you're going to get out of them. But they are just compendiums of maps and stat blocks and little adventures and puzzles that are ripe for jamming into other things. We've talked for a long time. That's probably a good place to consider stopping. And it's funny sitting here and just talking about it. It's like, you know what? I don't hate pre-builts. We haven't run one in a long time. They're not necessarily our style, at least anymore, but they really do have a lot going for them. And really, a lot of times it's just the polish.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good your idea or Wizards of the Coast idea was. If you don't enact it well and you don't adapt to the players well, it's not going to be a fulfilling story. So run pre-builts, run homebrew, be confident in your homebrew stuff. There's no one who's not creative. You will be able to come up with stuff, and it'll be a really good time for you and your friends.
Either way, take a lot of notes, and as you're taking in media, as you're watching movies and reading books or playing video games, jot down the little things that you notice that you like. The way, it's interesting what they did with the dwarves in this world. Like, I'll take note of that. And all of that just starts to piece together into into a kind of cohesive homebrew world. They're
both are good.
both are great.
Use both, and absolutely eviscerate any pre-built you can get your hands on and take all the goodies out of it. No matter what.
Pre-builts are tabletop RPG pinatas.
That is right. Smash them open, steal all the candy for yourself. And then it's pretty decent.
And then divvy it out to your players.
And then give it to your players.
Little bit by
That's
little
right.
bit. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. And I think that's a good place for us to stop this one. Hope you enjoyed this, found it interesting or helpful. If you want to, give your opinion down in the comments.
Yeah.
Do you prefer homebrew? Do you prefer pre-built, and why? And what has been your kind of favorite pre-builts?
Yes, favorite pre-builts and why.
In whatever systems you like to play, and like why, like what they did well, and what you're able, and kind of, or maybe what you've adjusted in them to make them run smoothly. Thank you everybody for watching and listening, and we will see / speak to you in the next one.
Like, I still feel like all I've played D&D wise is pre-built stuff. And it's like, I just kind of want to get back to a, like, more or less traditional high fantasy D&D, sprawling homebrew world. And let's go nuts and have fun and slowly come to regret every decision we've made because it has terrible, terrible consequences that make us sad. What I want is the Star Wars campaign we just ran, but in D&D. And, like, I didn't necessarily plan for... I have ideas for running other campaigns in this world that I'm prepping. Because just, like, doing stuff for, like, the Monster Hunter manual and stuff, just, like, every once in a while it's just like, oh, that's an interesting idea for, like a whole, like, main villain or, like,
or a big story arc.
A big story arc. But it's not necessarily what I had in mind, like, for the campaign, and... It's probably better to do something like that in a traditional kind of 1 through 20 world rather than an Epic 6.
Epic 6s can be constraining in what you can fairly make as a combat encounter.
Yeah.
Or they without having major adjustments.
Well, and it's just constraining in the types of characters players can make. It's also freeing in the types of characters players can make, but like in kind of a niche way. It's if you're going to do a big world that you continue to tell stories in, it's probably better if it's a 1 through 20.
Also, it's probably better if it's less slated towards a specific kind of story in terms of like the world you built tells a certain story.
I'm specifically building a something that's kind of a cross between The Witcher and Dragon Age because the Grey Wardens are essentially Witchers.
What? No, but the Witchers use their creation is like a weird alchemical ritual in order. Well, never.
That not very many people survive.
But in The Witcher, mages are super untrusted.
Kind of locked away in towers and secretive orders. You could almost call them circles. Yeah. Damn. And there's been histories of like wars between mages and.
Yeah, but it's very different though because like the mages in the Witcher world, they're like the reason they're so untrusted is because they can like consort with evil other world. Damn it! All right, you got me. Another fucking shame.
I just think they mesh very well at the very
least. But like the main like heroic Grey Warden is like a dude with like a trimmed beard and long hair that has 2 swords and fuck.
And it's both like they're both trying to mix elements of like sort of medieval court intrigue with like high fantasy themes, but they're also in some of those high fantasy themes trying to remain a little more grounded. They both have elves who used to rule like the whole continent, and
now are like second-class citizens,
or like wild elves wandering in the woods, and they're really bitter about it, and they don't have access to all that much of their own history.
Yeah. Can't argue it. Can't argue it.
It's just...
Is Duncan Geralt? ?
I feel like he would probably main character his way out of the fight.
The one in which he dies. Spoiler alert if you haven't.
Which is
gone through the first 20 minutes of
which is
the
why
first
I
Dragon Age
still
game.
want to play through. Are we recording?
We are.
We are? Cool.
Yeah.
I still want to play through Dragon Age Origins and make my character look as much like Duncan as possible. Because I have the DLC where you can go back to the battlefield
and get his gear,
a bunch of high-tier gear. Because I just want to show up at the Evil King's place dressed like Duncan with Duncan's swords and with Alistair dressed as the king in his armor.
That's a long con.
I just love the idea of being at the trial and being dressed, being like named Duncan, or like something close to Duncan.
Instead of Duncan, it's Dan Kuhn.
Yeah, Dan Kuhn. And like looking exactly like Duncan, and like and like Alistair's wearing the King Lark's armor. And you're just like both standing there. I just think, like, it is entirely... All of the payoff is for exactly that cutscene. And it just...
Oh, my God.
You know, it's like... it's the whole thing of, like, Micah's face when John Marston shows up to kill him in the epilogue of the game, dressed as Arthur Morgan and, like, riding his horse. It's just, like... It's just that exact
it's
thing.
Worth it.
Like,
it's worth it. It's a good payoff in the end.
Because players like nothing more than memeing on the villains. And
see our Star Wars campaign where in the final battle, instead of playing into an evil monologue and all, he just flipped him the bird.
Is players memeing a viable podcast topic?
You know, like memeing in good and bad ways in play,
Right.
I think could be a topic.
But you know, but
memeing
it's like,
and its place in your play.
Well, and that kind of opens up the possibility for like, you know, DMs to meme as well, as far as like villains, NPCs, and stuff like that. Like, it's like because you need to like, it's like to some degree, it's not necessarily a bad thing to let your players know. Like, it's like, all right, if you're gonna get memey with this, like, that's making it fair game.
That's right. It's memes should be treated the same way that anything in a D&D game is treated, where like we're doing an Underdark campaign and you were like, can I be a Gloomstalker Ranger? And I was like, yes, but that makes Gloomstalker Rangers canon and you will run into Gloomstalker Rangers.
So that's the immediate issue. It's like, ooh, like
that sounds scary.
I really want to play Gloomstalker Ranger because I love the idea of the whole party relying on dark vision, but they can't see Candle, the scout. He's called Candle because it's just like, where's Candle? And he just like lights a candle to like give enough actual like light for the rest of the party to see him. Like, I love that idea so much. But it does make Gloomstalkers canon, which is potentially an issue.
Yes.
You also, like, the campaign prep for that also, I believe, had the Drow having thermal vision.
Yeah.
Which was just like... It's like, the Drow can see you, which is why they're scary.
Yes, that even Gloomstalkers cannot hide from the Drow, because Drow used to not be playable, and they used to be a lot scarier than Drow are now, where they're just elves, but they don't like the sun. Instead it was like, the Drow are these horrifying alpha predators of the Underdark.
Which is why I just like wanted to like specifically sort of carry like flasks of Alchemist's Fire. So I love the idea of
flashbang them.
Yeah, working like against creatures with thermal vision of just it's like, this isn't a weapon. This is, I throw it down in the hallway, I grab somebody, and we run.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I think that it's often overlooked because of like some of the directions they've gone with modern D&D stories and stuff of like, and we kind of talked about this with making a like newsletter or something where we were talking about like make the Underdark scary again, and we do like topic on that. Like, I could definitely still write that if we end up doing that campaign ever and that becomes a relevant thing, because the Underdark, like, you have to like think about it and be like, what's in the Underdark? Think of like the scariest shit in the Underdark, and it's some of the scariest stuff in D&D. And the Drow are a functioning, albeit cutthroat, full society with cities that exist in that location. It's like, these are not your run-of-the-mill humanoids. These things are scary.
And it's
and
like,
they should be.
some degrees I have mixed feelings about it because, like, I totally understand Wizards' stance over the past few years of trying to, like, make the game as inclusive as possible and remove problematic references and a lot of that kind of stuff. I think it's a very admirable thing, especially in light of what, like, new TSR or, like Gary Gygax Jr. and that company have been doing recently with, like, because Brandon and I were talking about this the other day. He said, like, from what he understands, the rules of that system aren't just, like, subtly racist. It, like, actually it actually makes, like, sub-races of human, and, like, whites are, like, statistically the best one. It's like the worst shit imaginable, and, like, the whole system is also just, like,
it's not even thinly veiled racism. It's
sexist
just
and transphobic and just horrible, and they're trying to, like, intentionally get it confused with Wizards products, which is just, like, I just hate that people like that still exist. It's like what Sean James is just, like, said, it was just like, we're like, this is the year 2022, like, what is going on? Like, how are we still dealing with some of this shit?
How are there still warmongering tyrant warlords out there? Like, how is that a thing in the modern world?
It's just miserable. So I, like, especially in light of all that, I think what Wizards is trying to do of just, like, and like, just really, clean up a lot of stuff across rulebooks, even small references and the just, like, the wording that they use. To try and, there's one paragraph in the player's handbook that's like, it's like, hey, this is a role-playing game. Like, the worlds that you're building and the characters you're making, like, you can play any character you want. So don't feel limited by, like, gender rules and, like, sexualities and stuff like that. Like, play the characters you want to play. But they're just, like, trying to not just make it a paragraph that's, like, somewhere in the middle of the book, but make it kind of a forefront message. I think it's totally admirable. But part of what it means is changing the lore of a lot of, sort of just groups and monsters and stuff. As well as like the playable options and all that. Just, and some stuff going back, decades within the system to try and remove some of those problematic references and some of those issues. So it's like, on the one hand, it's like, the drow are less, like, scary than they used to be, but that's also not necessarily a bad thing. And, like, that's the thing about, like, you can, when building your own worlds in tabletop RPGs, like, you build your own villains and build your own lore and stuff into them. And as long as you're avoiding the, like, like, you can make the drow scary without making them problematic.
Yeah.
Which is, like, it's just the balance to be struck.
And it's in, like, with the specific example of that campaign idea, it's like, so long as no one's playing a drow, I can make them statistically as overpowered as I want to, because no one's playing one, so it doesn't throw off the balance of the game, and making it statistically different and powerful can be non-problematic still too. You can, like, you can do that in a way that's non-offensive, and there's not, like, an unfair, uncool referential sort of thing.
Well, and that's why, like, in my campaigns, like, I make dragons whatever color, chromatic or metallic I want them to be, without, like, but that's supposed to be an evil dragon. Just because, like, dragons are cool. I like black dragons myself. I think they just, like, just, like, in so many forms of fantasy, like, they just look so cool. But I also prefer dragons that breathe fire. So, like, by and large, my dragons breathe fire, and, like, morality is not limited by, like, the color of their scales. Yeah. And it just makes the world a little bit more complex anyway, which is a good thing. It's not... Part of the problem with following tabletop RPG rule sets to the letter is that it can kind of make worlds feel a little flat.
Samey,
or a little samey, absolutely, or a little just, like, kind of two-dimensional. actually like having some freedom there and kind of changing stuff as you see fit and making the world a little more complex is part of what breathes some life into it. I mean, that's original Dracos, you know what I mean? Of just like the world is kind of a topsy-turvy complex place, and like who the good guys are and who the bad guys are it's not entirely clear. Especially unless you look at the player characters, in which case these are the bad guys.
It's like an unbiased outsider's opinion of good versus evil, who the good and bad guys are, is very muddy in that world. But for the people living in that world, by their stance and space and experiences in their life, it's very clear to them who is good and who is evil. And I think that's a good thing for a world, is if the unbiased top-down view is very muddy and morally gray, but depending on where someone is and what their experiences are, there's very clear...
I've been reading a lot of history books recently. I've been just like on a nonfiction kick. So it's like, oh yeah, looking at like, elements of the, like the latter half of Roman history, 2,000 years removed from it. It's just like, man, some of this was like a real scumbag move, but on both sides. You know what I mean? It's like there's no good guys here. Like all these Roman writers and all these Roman rhetoricians and senators are going to, paint elements of what Rome is doing as in this really positive light. But it's not always easy to like take that same stance when you try and look at it from the perspective of some of the many groups that they were fighting.
And then you look at a non-biased top-down view of all of those groups, and you're like, oh, all of those groups practice this and that and the other. And it's like, oh yeah, people are the problem.
Yes.
Doesn't matter what group of people, doesn't matter what time period, people in all groups, there's some number of them that are the worst.
That's how... One of the ways to run a good D&D campaign is have a heavy faction-building element and make every other faction in the world essentially equal in terms of morality.
Yes.
As far as like, it's like, well, these guys are doing this, but they're not doing this. But these guys are doing that. But they're not doing that.
And think about it as edges and hindrances.
Yeah, there you go.
As long as in the end, like, this group may have no real hindrances, but they've got no real edges either. They're pretty neutral and pretty uninteresting. This group does this really good thing, but they are ran by this evil bastard. So, it's about the same as that neutral group in the algorithm and in the actual equation.
Medieval church overall, pretty miserable. These various convents and monasteries, really pretty good.
5 minus 5 equals 0 plus 0. This is just a fact.
And then let your player characters actually build something worthwhile. Attempt to tear it down.
Of course. Make them defend it, so they feel heroic and proud and brave when they are successful. But the dice fall as they will.
What are we talking about today?
They've been talking for about 20 minutes, so let's just keep going, and that's the podcast.
We need to